The United States attack on Venezuela on Saturday, where it forcibly seized President Nicolas Maduro and his wife, Cilia Flores, continues to have major fallout with reaction across the globe. There are serious implications for Venezuela and its future, and President Trump is also warning other countries in the region. Maduro and his wife were flown to the United States and both appeared in a Manhattan courtroom on Monday, where they pleaded not guilty to drug trafficking charges. Later in the show, our panel will weigh in on the major developments, but we begin with former Chilean ambassador to China, Jorge Heine. I talked with him earlier from Santiago. Ambassador Heine, thanks so much for joining us. There has been widespread international condemnation of this military assault by the United States on the capital Caracas and the forcible seizing of President Nicolas Maduro and his wife. What is your response to what has happened?
Well, my response is this. What has taken place in Venezuela over the past few days is unprecedented. Never in 200 years had the United States undertaken a military attack on the South American mainland. We had seen such attacks, such invasions in the case of Mexico, Central America, the Caribbean, but never on the South American mainland. So a threshold has been crossed. This is extremely serious. Mr. Trump has made comments about the situation in Colombia, the situation in Mexico, intimating that, they might be next. So we are here in uncharted waters and very difficult terrain.
When you say this is unprecedented on the South American continent, what are the implications of that? And does it set a precedent?
It absolutely sets a precedent. What you have to keep in mind is the following. Traditionally, the smaller Central American and Caribbean countries have been seen as very close to the United States, very dependent on the United States, and therefore sort of easy prey for gunboat diplomacy, which we have seen in the course of the early part of the 20th century and in some cases during the Cold War. But the larger South American countries have been traditionally being considered off limits. Now we are seeing that that is not the case. The other thing that is important to keep in mind is the following. Much of the rationale according to which this attack on Venezuela had been sold in previous weeks and months was on the basis that he had stolen the election and therefore it was fair game, as it were, for being attacked, in this case kidnapped. Well, what we are now hearing is that even democratic governments in Latin America should beware and could be easy prey for similar actions. So here we are basically entering, the law of the jungle. Anything goes. Again, very much upsetting, existing international law, the respect for national sovereignty and the United Nations Charter.
President Trump has accused President Maduro of drug offenses. Now, he has previously denied that, and so far we've seen no evidence that he has been involved in the shipment of drugs to the United States, although that could change once his trial starts. But to what extent has this got to do less with drugs and more to do with Venezuela's oil?
Yes, look, the whole thing about drug trafficking from Venezuela is bogus. There has never been a boat with fentanyl detained in the Caribbean, ever. The fentanyl flows comes from Mexico. So that's number one. Second, no serious study has classified Venezuela as a major producing country or as a transshipment point for drugs. Obviously, some drugs go out of Venezuela, as they do of many countries, but Venezuela is really not a major drug producing nor drug transiting country. So that's the second point. The third point that has to be made is this whole thing about Mr. Maduro running the Cartel de los Soles. There is no such thing as the Cartel de los Soles. So this is all smokescreen, and you're quite right. What is really behind this is the question of Venezuelan oil. Venezuela has 1/5 of all the oil in the world, 300 billion barrels. And moreover, it's not just a question of the oil deposits that Venezuela has. This also has to do with the question of the petrodollar, as you may know. Henry Kissinger reached an arrangement with Saudi Arabia in 1974 that oil transacted, internationally transacted, should be paid and valued in dollars.
Right.
What has been happening is that Venezuela was moving out of that and selling it in yuan and other currencies. Other countries have been doing that as well. And that for the United States would be a major blow. So this is one of the reasons we have seen what we saw on Saturday.
President Trump says that the United States will, in his words, run Venezuela, that's a nation of 30 million people, for an unspecified period. The Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, appeared on a number of television networks over the weekend. He walked back some of that, saying that they won't run the day-to-day affairs of Venezuela, but what they will do is maintain that military fleet off the coast of Venezuela and stop any ship carrying oil, whether it's allowed or whether it's not allowed, whether it's legal or illegal. I mean, can the United States run Venezuela?
Well, apparently the idea that is being floated is that Mr. Rubio would be a sort of acting viceroy of Venezuela, running it by phone, via phone from the State Department and communicating with various Venezuelan authorities, particularly with Ms. Nancy Rodriguez. I am not quite sure how that is supposed to work. I suppose the Trump administration has drawn the appropriate lessons from what happened in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and in Libya, that, you know, Western occupying forces in the end can only wreak great havoc and lead to the disaster that we have seen in those countries. So I guess the United States is being careful not to actually put boots on the ground. But whether you can run a country of 30 million people by phone from the State Department, I find it highly doubtful. I think the press conference that President Trump gave on Saturday raised many more questions than it provided answers. I think there are many question marks about how this is supposed to work.
Ambassador, the entire system of international law, which is already on life support when we look at what the Israelis are doing right now in Gaza, which a UN panel called a genocide, is that now completely destroyed when we see what has happened here in Venezuela?
I think you could say that. The moment you have a military attack on a country like Venezuela, bombing its capital of 3 million people, and kidnapping the president and his wife, saying this is a law and order operation, you can't have law and order operations like that. I mean, this is a clear violation of international law. It's a violation of the UN Charter. It's a violation of the basic principle of international law of not using violence and, you know, force, attacking other countries. Venezuela represents no threat to the national security of the United States in any way, shape, or form. And so this was a totally unwarranted attack.
Ambassador Jorge Heine, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
And for more now, let's get to our panel. Joining us here in Washington is Peter Kuznick. He is a history professor at American University. Also with us from Beijing is Einar Tangen. He is a senior fellow at the Center for International Government Innovation, and he's chairman of Asia Narratives Substack. And with us too is Anton Fedyashin. He is a professor of history at American University. Welcome to all of you. Peter Kuznick, let me start with you. We just heard there from Ambassador Heine. He was saying that this was an unwarranted attack on Venezuela, a sovereign nation, a member of the United Nations, and that it is a grave violation of international law. What is your reaction to what happened this past weekend and the forcible seizure of President Nicolas Maduro and his wife, Cilia Flores?
I think it's appalling. I think that the ambassador was absolutely correct. Not only is it a violation of international law, it's a violation of the U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 8. This is so outrageous, so beyond the pale, that the only one who would try something like this is Donald Trump. And Donald Trump does not mind that it's against the law. He likes that it's against the law, because it allows him to show how tough he is. You saw him up there with the war criminals behind him, Stephen Miller, Pete Hegseth, Marco Rubio. They thrive on this image of being tough guys. So the United States is the bully. We're the policeman. In the national security strategy, it said the Southern Hemisphere, this hemisphere is ours. Central America, South America is ours. We can do whatever we want. We've never seen anything quite like this. In some ways, it goes back to the old late 19th century, first 2 decades of the 20th century, almost 2.5, of intervening over and over and over again in Central and South America. And again, it's done in the interest not of democracy, not of human rights, not even of stopping drugs in this case, but of oil. So it's a naked power grab and a naked oil grab of the sort that is inconceivable and unconscionable, and the world should condemn it. But we see a tepid response from Europe. The Europeans have said, well, they hope it gets over with fast, and we have to follow the laws. But they haven't condemned this in any moral terms. It just shows their complete vassalage at this point to the United States and a loss of any moral backbone, which we've been seeing in other instances also. And so the other other countries in Latin America are appropriately worried because Trump and his supporters have ticked off a list of them, several of them, that we could also overthrow, intervene in, take their resources, and topple their governments. It's outrageous.
Einar, Tangen, China has also expressed its concern over what the United States has done, calling it a clear violation of international law. And China has called for the release of President Nicolas Maduro and his wife. What is your assessment of what happened?
Well, I see it as slightly different. If you start looking at the trajectory of what was happening and the buildup in terms of Venezuela, it really has a lot more to do, in my mind, with the Jeffrey Epstein files and the failed economic policies that the Trump administration has been pursuing. You'll note that over these last few days since it began, there has been no mention of the Epstein files. And for Donald Trump, this is exactly what he wants. He likes running a media circus. And instead of, saying, okay, let's digest what we've done in Venezuela, he's doubling down. He's threatening other countries. It's one thing, he says he has this narco-terrorism and all this stuff. I'll be interested to see how this works in the court when they have to put up real proof. It's going to be very, very difficult to establish this. My guess is he's counting on this going on for quite a while. But then you go to these threats to Greenland. Greenland is not a narco-terrorist state. He's just simply going out there and saying, I will take what I want, everything that my colleagues have indicated. But why? And why at this point? I believe it really has to do with a mixture of his desire to be transactional and to appear strong, at the same time as to bury these very, very nasty issues involving Epstein and the economy away.
Anton, President Maduro and his wife appeared in a court in New York. Both of them pleaded not guilty to these charges. The president, that is President Maduro, said he is innocent, he was kidnapped, and he is a, quote, prisoner of war. He also said, I am still president of my country. What is your view on what has happened?
Well, the United States is acting the way it has acted over 100 years. And Peter Kuznick earlier referred to the late 19th and the first 2.5 decades of the 20th century. But interventions, of course, American interventions in Latin America have continued throughout the 20th century, just with slightly less frequency, although one can argue with greater long-term consequences after 1945. So none of this is new, and to the grim realist in me doesn't feel at all surprised. The fate of Maduro was sealed as much by Donald Trump's decision as it also was by Maduro's decisions that he's made over the past several decades. Maduro was sold by his own government. There is absolutely no way that the military part of this operation could have been pulled off the way that it was pulled off without a sufficient amount of people being paid off by the Americans and essentially selling Maduro down the river. He may think of himself as still the president, but his vice president has just been inaugurated as the acting president, and she seems to be perfectly comfortable with carrying on. She made some noises yesterday, Ms. Rodriguez, about him still being president, but now she sounds a lot more relaxed. Today, at least in her public statements. And I have a feeling that the people in the Maduro cabinet and the ministers who were closest to him, in exchange for being left alone or for having charges dropped against him by the Americans, will simply play along. And it won't be the first time in Latin American history. There was a question that I think you asked Ambassador Heine earlier about how the United States intends to run a country of about 30 million people, which is, by the way, just for geographical reference, about twice the size of Germany. And I think the answer to that is the comprador elite. An elite that is bought by the United States, both a political and a commercial elite. And of that, the U.S. also has a very rich and well-documented history of running countries indirectly through such elites throughout Latin America and, by the way, the rest of the world.
Peter Kuznick, do you believe that that could happen, that the United States could buy off the elites in Venezuela, buy off the military in Venezuela as well, and rule the country by remote control, and in so doing they would take over Venezuelan oil fields as well, without deploying any US troops in that country? I mean, aren't there insurgent groups in that country that could cause chaos as well?
There are a broad range of groups there that could make this a nightmare for the United States. Anton mentioned that Venezuela is twice the size of Germany. It's also twice the size of Iraq. And we saw what 150,000 US troops was able to accomplish in Iraq. Venezuela is not hospitable terrain. It's mountains and jungles. They've been trained in guerrilla warfare. There are a lot of people who are still loyal to Maduro and Chavez. So while there are many people there who would be happy to work with the United States, there is no guarantee that there's going to be any stability. If we look at the track record of this kind of regime change, there's almost never a positive outcome. Almost never do you see this resulting in democracy and human rights. Not that that's the United States' concern. We've been happy to work with military dictators throughout the 20th and 21st century. But for the people of Venezuela, it's much more likely that there's going to be chaos, resistance, rebellion, bloodshed, than there is that this is going to have a positive and stable outcome.
Einar, Tangen, China has very strong economic, trade and diplomatic relationship with Venezuela. It imports Venezuelan oil. It's a major importer of Venezuelan oil. And China's foreign ministry said in a statement, China will remain committed to deepening practical cooperation with Venezuela in various fields. How will what the United States has done impact the China-Venezuela relationship?
Well, at stake is $100 billion that's been put over the last 20 years, and also imports of oil, but it's only about 2% of what China imports, and it could be replaced otherwise. But, this blockade, but the U.S. has announced, will put a serious dent in terms of any kind of oil coming out. Obviously, this is meant to starve Venezuela into submission. This is part of the remote things. But if I may, I want to get beyond these questions that we're looking at right now. We have two trajectories in the world. We have the United States saying that we can act as a mafia state. We can take what we want. We can go back to, pre-World War II days when it was fashionable to just simply take over other countries because you wanted to. You could give thin excuses, no excuses. It didn't really matter. You would just say it's our destiny. It's our need for security. Then you have what China has been offering, which is a world order based on initiatives that have to do with security, have to do with development, respect for sovereignty, and then having a global governance order. And this is based on civilizational values and values where countries can work together and you do not have the law of the jungle. And that's clearly what we have here. And, let's look at the trajectory in terms of time. What the US has done is short term. There's no way that they're going to do anything for the poor people and those were the ones that put this Bolivar revolution in and put Chavez and then Maduro and kept him in, was this idea that the poor will not receiving the benefits of one of the richest countries in the world. So at this point, they will continue to work with the elites. The elites will ignore the poor, and you have the same problem. The poor will rise up because they have nothing to lose, and we will just have more chaos because of these types of actions.
Right. Anton, as we are all fully aware, the President Trump that is, has warned other countries that they could face consequences as well if they don't toe the United States line. Do you think President Trump will be emboldened to act against other countries? He's even threatened Greenland.
Yes, absolutely. And this also falls into an historic pattern, not just in the United States, but since we're talking about the U.S., let's focus on the U.S., which is that successful short military campaigns are mistaken for wise long-term diplomatic policy. I'll give you the most recent example of this, which was the stunning victory of the United States over Saddam Hussein's Iraq in 1991. And then the expectation that the second installment in 2003 would be as easy and prove as successful. And if in military terms, the invasion and the toppling of Saddam Hussein's government in 2003 was a fairly rapid operation, the consequences of staying in Iraq and actually running it, and Peter was absolutely right in referring to the number of troops that it took and the fact that the whole endeavor failed ultimately, that is a different issue. What we just saw in Venezuela from a purely military operational perspective really was a stunningly successful operation. And I'm afraid that it won't be just Donald Trump, but it will be the much more dangerous neocons around him that will interpret this as sort of a blessing for moving on from Venezuela to potentially Cuba, maybe Colombia, that was mentioned, perhaps other countries in Latin America. And then, of course, there is the Greenland question. And there, the military aspect is really not even relevant because the United States will have absolutely no resistance from the locals or the Danes. It will, however, if there is a move into Greenland, it will damage NATO to the point where the alliance will simply implode, something that it's already struggling with around the Ukraine crisis. But ultimately, let me reinforce what Einar said, which is that the broader trend here is that this kind of behavior is simply going to inspire more countries to look for alternatives to a US-dominated geoeconomic and geopolitical system. And one of the beneficiaries of this will be the BRICS Plus Forum, which will probably expand its ranks within the next 3 years of Donald Trump's presidency.
Right. Peter Kuznick, to Anton's point about what smaller countries do, I saw an interview with Professor Jeffrey Sachs from Columbia University in which he said that this is going to lead to nuclear proliferation.
Well, I hope not. I hope that's not the direction that this goes. The world is already on the brink of nuclear threats. You remember back on June 11th, Tulsi Gabbard released that 2.5-minute video, starting off with scenes in Hiroshima, and she said, the world is closer to nuclear annihilation than it's ever been. And then more recently, Sergei Narishkin, the head of Russian SVR intelligence agency, said that this is the greatest threat to civilization that we've ever seen. So we already know that we're very, very close to nuclear threats.
Okay, and that is where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anton Fedyashin in Washington.